I'm Dan Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's John Berkelen Lecture, The New Right's Cultural Politics, which will be delivered by Johannes von Moltke, professor of Germanic languages and literatures and film, TV, and media at the University of Michigan. Whatever happened to simple titles, you know? Anyway, this is a melancholy evening because it is the final lecture, Fellows Lecture, it says fall 24. I don't think that's right. I think it's the spring of 24. You're all invited to stay. Of this class of fellows, and you know, but judging by the turnout, it's going to be okay. Are any of you actually sitting in the Wannsee? I can't. A lot of people way back there. Do you know everyone who's here? Are these all friends and family? Anyway, Johannes will examine the pattern of the new right's weaponization of culture on both sides of the Atlantic, and in order to understand the cultural logic of the resurgent right-wing politics globally. I'll just remind you that we're a nonpartisan institution before I go any further, or at least I have to be nonpartisan. The John Berkelen Fellowship was established in February of 2011 with a generous gift from John P. Berkelen to promote German-American dialogue in the humanities. Past recipients have included the renowned historian John Connolly, and if you ever get a chance, I suggest you watch the extraordinary talk he gave last year. Literary historians Martin Puchner, who is fascinating in everything he does, Susan McCabe, Barbara Nagel, and others. John Berkelen supported the American Academy in myriad ways and was a longtime member of our board, serving from 2004 to 2012. I think he had no German ancestry whatsoever, but as a young man in the early 1950s, he worked in, of all things, naval intelligence in Berlin. Now, exactly why there was naval intelligence in Berlin is hard to ascertain, but it was the early Cold War, and there were plenty of strange things going on in that period. They were probably also spying on Army intelligence. In any case, he built a long and very successful career in finance. It's way too much to talk about here, but the key points are that he was a representative of the Rothschilds in the US and invested in a range of startups. Among those fledgling companies was one called Federal Express and another one called Amgen. So I think he had a good eye for talent. He eventually rose to be head of the venerable banking firm of Dillon Read. He was an extraordinarily public-minded individual, and when the first President Bush asked him to run an investment program for post-communist Poland, he did so straight away. What I particularly like about John Berkelen's biography is that he never stopped being an intellectual, and in his free time he wrote a biography of Gustav Stresemann, not something too many heads of Dillon Read did. He was a great supporter of the humanities and a donor, outstanding donor to the National Humanities Center, to the Frick Collection, to Princeton, his alma mater, the New York Public Library, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Teach for America, and of course, the American Academy in Berlin. So we are really pleased to have Johannes as this semester's Berkelen Fellow. And now to introduce Johannes. So I gave you that long title, I'm not going to repeat it. He completed his bachelor's at a small but beloved college called Dartmouth. And I know that the place is filled with Dartmouth people tonight. And he got his PhD in literature at Duke. He is the author of The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America. That was published in 2015, and No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema. That was in 2005, and it was a winner of the MLA's Scaglione Prize for Best Book in German Studies. He is published widely in the New German Critique in October, Screen, Cultural Critique, Cinema Journal, Germanic Review, and many other journals, and has also participated in many edited volumes. He is currently the vice president of the American Friends of Marbach, the great literary archive here in Germany, and a former president of the German Studies Association. His research has been supported by the German Academy Exchange Service, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Study. To me, perhaps most interestingly, he has been translating, putting together an English edition of the last letters exchanged in 1944-45 between his grandparents, Helmut James and Freya von Moltke, who are great figures of the resistance to the Nazis. It would be unsolipsistic for me to not note that Freya von Moltke moved to a certain village in Norwich, which all the von Moltkes are connected with, and which I live in when I'm not here. It's called Norwich. Come visit, don't stay too long. Over the past few years, he's been doing this edition, and we're all looking forward to it. As a descendant of resistance fighters to the Nazis, or resistance figures to the Nazis, Johannes has also recently signed an urgent appeal to protect democracy against right-wing extremism, and it's under the heading "Learn from History, Strengthen Democracy." The signatories warn that populists are gaining too much support in too many countries. And I think that is going to lead directly into your talk. He will speak for about 35 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. And if you are here, raise your hand, you know how to do that. Please do wait for the microphone. If you're joining us by Zoom, type your question into the Q&A part of the platform. Johannes, it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to everybody here at the Academy who's welcomed us and allowed us to stay in this phenomenal place and created such a welcoming and supporting environment and nourishing us in more ways than one. And thanks to Linda for helping to set up tonight. I want to give a special shout out to my fellow fellows. What a privilege and a treat it's been to get to know you, work alongside you, and celebrate Passover and compete in the first ever Academy Olympics together. It's been real. What's not real is the idea that we're about to disperse again in a few short weeks, and you heard Dan say it here, we're all invited to stay for the fall. And thank you to everyone here for making the long trek out to Wannsee on a big soccer night, no less. I'll do what I can to stay within time so that you can catch the second half at least. And one more thing to the live stream. I'm especially happy to know that my sister is able to tune in from Princeton on the live stream. I haven't had, hi Dorothea. I haven't had enough opportunities to say this, but Dorothea has been there for a lot of the big and small decisions that have led me to where I find myself today, and not just professionally. And the same goes for Kerstin and Lena in the front row here. I'm just so thrilled that we got to spend these months together here before heading back into the trenches at Michigan. So on to the business of metapolitics in quotes. I'll explain why the quotes are important to me. If Donald Trump has his way, the American Academy in Berlin will face some serious competition, at least in name. Last November, Trump announced his plans to launch a new American Academy, not in Berlin or Rome, but online, claiming that Harvard and, quote, other once respected universities, end of quote, are, quote, turning our students into communists and terrorists and sympathizers of many, many different dimensions. Trump used a brief campaign video to outline his plan for a free degree-granting online college to compete with what he called legacy institutions. Carefully avoiding the tainted term university for his own venture, he nonetheless promised an entire universe, his words, of the highest quality educational content. He even offered a business model. Free of charge to all Americans, the Academy would be funded by taxing, fining, and suing private university endowments. A, quote, top-tier education option for the people, end of quote. Trump's American Academy would, of course, be strictly non-political, his words, there would be no wokeness or jihadism allowed. Coming from the namesake of the fraudulent Trump University, this vision of an American academy is, to coin a phrase, a bit rich. Accordingly, it met with some derision, but it also incurred a healthy dose of skepticism. After all, it's difficult to imagine much political appetite presently in the United States for expanding public funding for higher education, let alone under a Republican candidate. But then again, as the references to wokeness, jihadism, and sympathizers of many, many dimensions plainly suggest, the pitch was always intended less as a policy proposal, let alone a viable business model. Rather, the Academy announcement was a volley in the ongoing culture wars, for which higher education has long served as a battleground. And you've given the drumbeat of news from US campuses and now also from Humboldt and today the Free University. But think also of the fight over curricula in states like Florida and Texas. Think of Ron DeSantis's MAGA makeover of New College, of Elise Stefanik's ongoing bid to effectively wrest control from the presidents of Harvard, MIT, Penn, and Columbia. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but she did tweet 2 down when the first 2 presidents had to take their hats and leave. Or think of the bait and switch of a major web portal like PragerU, which, like Trump University, has nothing to do with an accredited university. Instead, it is a video platform that offers a, quote, free alternative to the dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education by, quote, promoting American values. These are only some examples from the US, to which we could add countless European ones, from Viktor Orban's illegal ousting of Central European University from Hungary in 2019, illegal by the standards of the EU, to seemingly less conspicuous projects like the recent founding of an online Gegenuni, counter-university, in Germany for spreading, in their terms, conservative and patriotic contents. The Gegenuni would offer what they call a new right diploma, and prepare the ground for a political reconquest that at least one prominent advocate considers, quote, synonymous with a reconquest of, wait for it, the humanities. Dominate the intellectual airspace, so the thinking goes, and you can march in the political ground troops. This is the battle Trump joined with his announcement last November. Even as he ostensibly argued for a strictly non-political American academy, Trump was making what the right would call a meta-political play in higher education, an intervention designed to move culture and discourse to the right. The term meta-politics will be familiar to many in this room, and that is significant in its own right, as I'll argue in a minute. But for those who aren't fluent in alt-right newspeak, let me briefly gloss the notion. We owe the concept largely to the work of Alain de Benoist, a key thinker of the French Nouvelle Droite, but its pithiest formulation comes from Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News, who's often quoted as saying that politics is downstream from culture. Meta-politics, accordingly, is what happens upstream from politics in the cultural realm. This realm becomes construed as meta in the sense that it's above, beyond, or somehow before politics, and sometimes the German translation is vorpolitisch. In the patently instrumentalist sense in which Breitbart intended this catchphrase, there's a strategic interest in commandeering cultural positions to realize political gains downriver. The fluvial image condenses and simplifies Benoist's earlier theoretical derivation of meta-politics from the work of Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, minus the Marxism, of course. Drawing on Gramsci's martial vocabulary of class struggle, Benoist describes meta-political organizing as a strategy in an all-out war of position and a cultural revolution from the right. That's the title of the book in German here. In a reversal of classical Marxist assumptions about the secondary importance of culture and ideas, the so-called superstructure, Benoist considers the occupation of cultural terrain and the redefinition of a cultural common sense a necessary precondition for acceding to political power. This concept of metapolitics, and with it the idea of achieving cultural hegemony, has been described by scholars of the New Right as the most hegemonic of all radical right concepts. Now, the very currency of metapolitics as a notion indexes, I think, the success of the strategy that it names. The fact that the term appears to have entered our political vocabulary, whether through Benoit or through Breitbart, is part of what the metapolitical project seeks to accomplish. It would consequently be a mistake to construe the concept of metapolitics as a formal, politically neutral description of all sorts of discursive mobilization, as if it were just another term for the politics of culture. It's instead a term of art and a political concept deployed by the new right, and it needs to be analyzed as such. The unmarked use of metapolitics, this is my point about the quotation marks, now generally indexes a right-wing worldview signifying ostensibly lost values of masculinity, authority, anti-egalitarianism, nationalism, and ethnic homogeneity. Opposed in name only to identity politics, it is deeply identitarian. As Alexandra Stern quips, her quote, "Metapolitics is white nationalist consciousness raising at the collective level." How then does such consciousness raising proceed? In what manner and through which media does the right pursue the kind of cultural activism that metapolitics describes? What are its modes, its techniques, its patterns? And what are its principal themes? These are some of the questions I pursue in my research. For that purpose, I look at some key metapolitical sites that include the university and higher education, as I suggested at the outset, but also literature and publishing. And this is work that I've been doing in particular with a colleague in Frankfurt, Susanne Comfort-Hein. And we've been very interested in the fact that the right has been producing these book clubs through which they spread reading tips, but also reading habits, podcasting, social media, and YouTube networks. Across these sites, I track discursive struggles over concepts such as wokeness and cancel culture, and metapolitical euphemisms such as ethno-pluralism or remigration, a term I'm sure you've all heard about, over the politics of identity and memory, and over the very meaning of culture itself, as for example in the right-wing conspiracy theory on cultural Marxism. And I should put quotation marks around this image because that's a conspiracy meme. I'm not saying smash cultural Marxism. What interests me in each of these cases are as much the semantic details of individual instances as the larger political patterns that they allow us to discern. And for that purpose, I find it particularly useful to adopt a transatlantic perspective that allows us to see both the transnational and the nationally specific dimensions of right-wing countercultures. This perspective also informs my theoretical orientation, for which I draw on the analysis of earlier right-wing resurgences in the United States by the Institute for Social Research, often referred to as the Frankfurt School. As refugees from Nazism during the 1930s and 40s, scholars such as Theodor W. Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Leo Löwenthal, and others developed an acute view of the Roosevelt era's demagogic capture of populism and what they then called fascist agitation. Today, we would call it metapolitics, and their analysis is newly relevant. With this perspective in mind, let me attempt to characterize the New Right's metapolitical project, always with quotation marks, please, for you, by attending to its form, its content, and its history. And this will be relatively sketched cursorily, of course, in the time I have here. Though these are, of course, intertwined, I separate them out here for the sake of argument, treating metapolitical forms under the notion of acceleration, their contents under the heading of appropriation, and their historical dimension as agitation in the sense that I just referred to above. I'll explain these headings as I go along. What's at stake throughout, I will suggest, is not just the cultural redefinition of a new right and the blurring of political lines, but the challenge that so-called metapolitical organizing poses for a pluralist democracy. Action, action, action. Steve Bannon leans into this phrase to trademark his persona and brand his long-running podcast, War Room, currently nearing its 3,600th episode. The three words appear on a sign behind Bannon at his mic in the studio set, and they're emblazoned on the swag you can buy at the War Room store or on Amazon. Bannon himself uses the phrase liberally and loosely, exhorting his listeners during his rambling monologues to exert their political agency, but also their buying power. Painting a picture of an American economy driven into the ground by so-called socialist and globalist Democrat policies, Bannon underlines the urgency even of his host-read advertising appeals to purchase pillows, dietary supplements, and tax advice by hammering out his trademark staccato, action, action, action. And I'm going to spare us this image for a bit. Although Bannon's podcast is clearly designed in part to drum up an electorate, if not the shock troops he hints at by calling his listeners the War Room Posse, the principal thrust of the Twice Daily shows is destructive, to take down what he describes as the mainstream establishment and to plan for the end of the looming end of the dollar empire. This is the title of a 5-volume ebook series authored by Bannon, and although Mark Koplovich argued from this podium just a couple weeks ago very persuasively that this is the last thing we should be worried about in the current situation, Bannon is invested in keeping us worried, reading out advertisements for Patriot Supply prepper kits of daily rations designed to last in storage for 25 years. But the apocalypse will surely come before then, and the show's relation to the cataclysm is performative in the linguistic sense. Bannon aims to bring it about by talking for 2-hour-long episodes daily. This is what I would call the accelerationist leading edge of right-wing activism. Accelerationism is a term first developed on the left as a Marxist heresy that was to point away beyond the impasse of neoliberal stasis or of the exhaustion of revolutionary energies or the end of history. Heighten the contradictions inherent in capitalism, accelerate them, so the thinking went, and you hasten the advent of revolution. Bannon adopts this stance for the right in his resolute commitment to push hard on popular discontent, financial crises, and the destructive tendencies of globalism. Rather than offer solutions, he seeks to accelerate these trends through disinformation to bring liberal democracy to the breaking point. And this is just one slide out of a study that the Brookings Institution did, which shows Bannon as the clear extreme outlier on disinformation and lies around COVID and elections, et cetera, which was one of the things that motivated me to pick him. I mean, he's like the furthest, most extreme example in that metric, at least. A similar tendency informs German New Right circles, where Reichsbürger are already aiming for the self-sufficiency that Day X will require. As if to drive home the importance of always staying on the move, the Austrian right-wing activist Martin Sellner records many of his Audioanalysen podcasts from behind the wheel of his moving car. And an accelerationist strand also informs the seemingly more genteel version of the German New Right as it takes shape in Schnellroda. For those unfamiliar with Schnellroda, you might think of this as command central of German metapolitics. The hamlet in Sachsen-Anhalt is home to the Institut für Staatspolitik, which shares an acronym with the Institute for Social Research, and that's not coincidental, I think, as well as the right-wing publishing house Antaios. Overseen by the couple Götz Kubitschek and Ellen Kosica, the Institute boasts regular visits from AfD members such as Björn Höcke and Maximilian Krah, who was in the news today for having his offices raided. We won't go into this. The operations in Schnellroda also include the bi-monthly journal Sezession, semi-annual academies, regular podcasts, a blog, and an eponymous Kanal Schnellroda on YouTube. But the embrace of new media in Schnellroda does not jettison the old. The Antaios publishing arm maintains a carefully cultivated investment in reading and literature through books and bibliophilia, including the subscription series Kaplaken, now in its second decade. Among the initial volumes in that series, Götz Kubitschek published his own Provokation, which has become a key reference point for goading the far right into action. Making good on the book's title, Kubitschek offers a manifesto of sorts, a call to arms, in what he describes as a proto-Civil War moment. The text underlines the urgency of that moment with talk of time running out, verrinnende Zeit, and stark alternatives of life and death, resistance or disappearance, Gegenwehr oder Verschwinden. Given the sense of imminent revolution that Kubitschek conjures up, the casual reader of this pamphlet might easily draw parallels to manifestos across the political spectrum, or so it might seem, until one attends to the ethno-nationalist logic that undergirds Kubitschek's rant. However revolutionary the rhetoric, his is a manifesto against immigrants, against a quote-unquote multicultural future, against egalitarianism. And it is a rallying cry for downtrodden ethnic Germans who need to mount a concerted act of resistance lest they verschwinden. Consequently, Kubitschek exhorts his readers to join his terms, battle for hegemony in an autochthonous space. The German phrase, Kampf Vorherrschaft im eigenen Raum, adds a latent resonance to Nazi notions of Raumordnung and Lebensraum. For anyone who cared to read, this and subsequent texts develop the themes discussed at the conspiratorial meeting on a master plan for remigration reported at the beginning of this year by Correctiv. After all, the far right has been nothing if not consistent in peddling the conspiracy theory of a great replacement, according to which Kubitschek's autochthonous space is under threat by what they call replacement immigration, Ersetzungseinwanderung, an ostensible project to overwhelm and substitute ethnic Germans with foreign immigrants. Kubitschek's Provokation staked an influential position that is no less accelerationist than Bannon's for being moderately less brash. Impatient with the kinds of reflection, thought, deliberation, and debate that characterize liberal democracy, Kubitschek wants social and political conflict to manifest as crisis, whose advent he would hasten. Let's desire the crisis. Wünschen wir uns die Krise. Instead of more talk, Kubitschek would like to see an open declaration of war, his terms, of the kind that Bannon offers in the trailer to every episode of his podcast, which I don't have time to play for you, but which includes the line, "Pray for our enemies, because we're going medieval on these people." To ensure the plausible deniability characteristic of such right-wing calls for violence, Kubitschek is careful to specify that the civil war he has in mind is spiritual, not physical. A geistiger Bürgerkrieg, a spiritual or intellectual civil war, a term that preserves the violent dimension of the new right's metapolitics, even as it ostensibly denies it. Accordingly, the skirmishes Kubitschek has in mind begin with the sharpening of concepts, die Zuspitzung der Begriffe, and the identification of enemies, Kennzeichnung der Gegner. The Schnellroda think tank and publishing house have invested into precisely these tasks, sharpening concepts and identifying enemies through educational activities and reading materials, from semi-annual seminars for under 35-year-olds. I find this really interesting. They insist you have to be under 35, to 5-minute book reviews on YouTube. But it bears noting that, like the metapolitical project at large, and for all the genteel intellectualism that Schnellroda exudes, this conceptual work is paired with a profoundly anti-academic and ultimately anti-intellectual gesture that privileges action over thought. In the end, Kubitschek explicitly calls for the act, his line, the act that renders superfluous the reading of half a library worth of books, end of quote. The act that deliberately breaks with stultified conventions, the act that steps out of the bounds of democracy by refusing to play by its rules. What Kubitschek calls for is, in other words, action, action, action. In light of its accelerationist stances, it makes sense to speak of an activist new right, a term that captures not just Kubitschek's decisionist act and Bannon's modus operandi, but also right-wing stances in the culture wars on both sides of the Atlantic. For examples beyond Bannon and Schnellroda, we need only think of other meta-political initiatives like the stacking of school boards and challenges to ban library books in the United States, up by hundreds of % in recent years, or groupings like the Identitarians in Europe and the Querdenker in Germany. This activist strand arguably aligns metapolitics more closely with socially progressive forms of political organizing than with traditional notions of conservatism. If we were to abstract from the goals of a return to traditional gender roles, racial segregation, and what the right calls the reconquista of the state, if we set aside the content, that is, metapolitics can certainly appear formally oriented toward renewing rather than conserving the status quo. This makes theoretical sense, given Benoit's derivation of metapolitics from Marxism and the New Right's concerted effort to learn from '68, especially through the French Nouvelle Droite. If we go further back in the New Right's lineage, we also find here its deep roots in the so-called conservative revolution of the interwar years, roots whose ramifications for the New Right thought and action Volker Weiss has reconstructed in several field-defining publications, and he's in the room today. What is striking, though, is that metapolitical organizing also borrows its contents from progressive causes. This derivative gesture has variously been described in the scholarship as a form of discursive piracy, as retortion, as mimicry, as reversal, or as a subversion from above in this really useful book by Xavier Zasse from last year. But whatever you call it, the harnessing of progressive causes to right-wing ends lends itself to confusion of political polarities. I would describe this confusion as endemic to the metapolitical project, and it's adumbrated already in the blind activism, what in German one would call Aktionismus, described above. This confusion has consequences for the ways we think of culture and counterculture in a democracy, and I'll come back to this in my conclusion. But first, let me outline, by way of just a small sampling, how metapolitics burrows into left-wing or progressive concepts through an aggressive form of appropriation. In the process, those concepts become hollowed out and perverted as the New Right turns them inside out. Take, for example, the 2023 Stolzmonat campaign, a literal German translation of Pride Month. The coordinated social media drive took direct aim at the LGBTQ+ community, which it impugned for, and I'm quoting from this post here, rainbow crap and gender madness. But it did so by appropriating and re-signifying the organizing notion of queer pride, as well as the use of rainbow overlays for profile pictures during Pride Month. Only now, pride, or Stolz, was to be patriotic and German, and the rainbow was replaced by the gradated colors of the German flag. And sometimes the meme to go with it was, Deutschland ist bunt genug, you know, the German flag is already colorful enough. Celebrated by, and you can see here, I mean, the AfD really signed on to this and helped push it. Celebrated by Sellner and others as a resounding success, Stolzmonat appropriated and distorted the appeal of Pride Month for recognizing difference and diversity, and replaced it with an assertion of nationalism and tradition. More than just a way of owning the libs, as New Right parlance has it, and I only discovered this week that the German New Right translates that as die Lippen besitzen, which is weird. More than just a way of owning the libs, as New Right parlance has it, this campaign adopted the strategies of appropriation to effect an active exclusion, among other things, from national belonging of those who would identify with or simply support LGBTQ+ rights. It's either you're for us or you're against us, and you can't be both. This pattern of appropriation and aggressive resignification extends from online campaigns and visual culture to the use of language and concepts. Much like the Stolzmonat campaign, white supremacist memes such as White Lives Matter, White Power, and Stop White Genocide depend for their provocation on the movements and values they pervert, on the history and memory of Black Power, on the Black Lives Matter movement, and on the remembrance of historical genocide. Even when these phrases merely, and I put that in quotation marks, circulate as memes on the internet and social media, they exert a semantic violence that appears all the more glaring in light of the careful reconstructive work around the visual culture of the Black Panther movement that Lee Rayford shared with us earlier this semester. I'm going to take this one off the screen too. While the broad resignification of the civil rights movement is more characteristic for the US context, we can observe parallel moves in Europe, where even the naming of the far-right alternative for Deutschland, or Sverige in Sweden also, rewires earlier notions of a progressive alternative. Or take the AfD's disdain for Willkommenskultur, Germany's unprecedented openness to migrants fleeing wars in Syria and Afghanistan in 2015. While opposition to this culture of welcome is virtually the AfD's raison d'etre, its DNA, the central plank of its anti-immigration and pro-remigration platform, the party had no problem also appropriating the term for its own ethno-nationalist ends by promoting a Willkommenskultur für deutsche Kinder. A similar logic of reversal defines the new rights-fraught interventions in German memory culture, or what pundits like Kubitschek and Sellner refer to as the country's Schuldkult, its cult of guilt. The efforts of the AfD to minimize the role of the Holocaust in German history, which made it to the parliamentary debates, are by now well known, but the more perfidious tendency runs deeper and involves redefining the very notion of what it would mean for Germans to continue working through their nation's past. For the real Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, that's a quote from Martin Sellner, the real Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, Martin Sellner would have us know, would involve confronting not fascism and the Holocaust, but the move away from ethno-cultural definitions of German identity, a move that the right calls ethno-masochism. That's what we should be spending our time worrying about in memory culture. There is a logic of branding behind such conceptual contortions. The metapolitical reoccupation of terms aims to inspire a new class of political feelings that brings the so-called far-right up close and rewires racism and sexism as attractive affects. In keeping with the broader project of metapolitics, this production of rechte Gefühle, as Simon Strick calls them, reverses political polarities. Progressive notions such as the expansion of rights to minoritized identities, social justice, and equality become connected to reactionary aims, the return to a status quo ante, remasculinization, the exclusion of difference, and the protection of majoritarian identities that have been construed as immutable, traditional, essential. Once this has been accomplished, or as part of the ironic culture through which this is to be accomplished, the identitarians can join the debate on anti-racism by asserting, both contrafactually and cynically, 100% identity, 0% racism. To be clear, I'm not speaking of left-right equivalences here, which would be false equivalencies at best. If there are mirror effects at play, and I wouldn't deny that there are, they're generated not by simple reflection, but by distortion and indeed by projection. In the mirror funhouse of metapolitics, to offer one final example, racism is something suffered predominantly by whites. This is the fundamental proposition that Antaios author Martin Lichtmes spells out in pseudo-theoretical detail in his Kaplaken volume, Die Verteidigung des eigenen, in defense of what is ours. The short treatise offers a case study in victim reversal. Drawing on an admittedly sloppy reading of Frantz Fanon, the preeminent critic of colonialism, whom he says, I don't feel like reading in more than cursory fashion. It's in the text. Lichtmes sets out to describe a renewed colonialism in the contemporary Western world, except that now the Germans, and by extension white Europeans and Anglo-Americans, appear not as colonizers, but as victims of colonization themselves. Lichtmes seems aware of how implausible this reversal will sound to some, but he doubles down, insisting that beginning in 1945, quote, the German, der Deutsche, has become, quote, something like the N-word of Europe after 1945. And you can imagine that he doesn't write the N-word. With this aggressive resignification, Lichtmes also buttresses the popular right-wing trope of Germany's forced democratization by the Allies after World War II. Adopting Fanon as his unlikely guide, Lichtmes implicitly ties Germany's pre-colonial identity, its true national self, to the moment prior to its subjugation from outside through American re-education, that is, to Germany before 1945. This, too, is a recurring trope among the New Right, which, as the literary scholar Heinrich Detering has shown, has filtered into German parliament through the speeches of the AfD. And this is, we could talk later about the relationship of metapolitics to politics. This would be one way of thinking about that. It actually sort of trickles down. But Lichtmes is far from finished, going on to claim that colonial subjection now characterizes all white peoples whom it saddles with what he calls, in English in the original, white guilt, a guilt that portends an auto-genocidal crisis of the whole Western world. Those were obviously quotes. This is again the language of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Occasionally cloaked in the above-mentioned hyperbole of white genocide, it manages to conflate racist and Holocaust imagery, to which Lichtmes adds an anti-Semitic twist by blaming white people's ongoing colonial bondage on the global dominance of Goldman Sachs. The trope of the rootless wandering Jew becomes the paradigm for the dislocation of the self, die Enthaltung des Eigenen. It always sounds a little bit Heideggerian. Germany becomes, quote, a madhouse of depressive colonials and sleepwalkers who don't even recognize their own enslavement, end of quote. From there, it's only one step to the opposite trope, that self-identification of Germans is to be with the Jews as the Jews of Europe, and the lament that anti-Germanism has become the new anti-Semitism. There's heavy breathing in the room. Not much more, I promise. So much for the sharpening of concepts advocated by Kubitschek. We've arrived in a conceptual hall of mirrors in which everything is also its opposite, where colonizers are colonized, perpetrators are victims, democracy is dictatorship. In this Orwellian landscape, it becomes difficult to discern logic from counter-logic, perception from projection, fact from fiction. These are, of course, the traits of what critics have described as the post-truth era of alternative facts, and what Naomi Klein, in her thought-provoking recent book Doppelganger, calls our mirror world. And I quote from Klein, "A world where, on either side of the reflective glass, we're not having disagreements about differing interpretations of reality, we're having disagreements about who is in reality and who is in a simulation." But although this mirror world may seem bewildering, new, and unprecedented, it has a history for which we might look to Michel Foucault's work on the relationship between truth and power, to Hannah Arendt's influential discussions of truth and lying in politics, or to Sophia Rosenfeld's assessment of the tenuous history of democracy and truth in her recent book by that title. Or we might turn to the work of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory in response to the fascist assault on both democracy and truth in the 20th century. In adopting the accelerationist stance and pursuing appropriative strategies that we've been discussing, metapolitics not only countenances, but actively fosters the same disorientation that Siegfried Kracauer found to be the goal of totalitarian propaganda almost a century ago. In a draft that remained unpublished during his lifetime, but has recently begun to receive scholarly attention, Kracauer describes propaganda fundamentally as such a project of disorientation. In the tumult of propaganda, he writes, nothing holds, down is up, and up is down. Propagandists, he says, totally turn truth on its head by blaming the opponent for just those actions and machinations that they themselves are pursuing. To rethink metapolitics as a form of propaganda, whether with Kracauer or others, would require more time than we have here. So let me suggest instead that we limit ourselves to a subset of propaganda discussed around the same time as agitation by other writers in the orbit of the Frankfurt School. While Kracauer's concern in 1936 was with European fascism, the Institute for Social Research that had commissioned his report would soon add an American dimension to the study of propaganda in the large-scale Studies on Prejudice, launched jointly with the American Jewish Committee. Based in New York and California, the Frankfurt School thereby responded to what we might call the metapolitics of their own moment, From Lindbergh's America First movement and the seditious activities of the Silver Shirts, to the anti-Semitic radio addresses by Detroit-based Father Charles Coughlin, to the incipient McCarthyism of the Dease Committee that developed the playbook for today's MAGA right, as Jim Shapiro showed in his illuminating talk earlier this semester. From a transatlantic perspective, this tenuous period in US history, as well as the analyses by the Frankfurt School that it spawned, seem to me as relevant for thinking about the renewed rise of the right today as the conservative revolution and the waning of democracy during the Weimar Republic in Germany. At the time, these developments spurred on the analytical and theoretical work of the authoritarian personality, a vastly influential multi-author study that sought to understand what made the potential fascist personality tick. And the insights from this study would go on to inform broad sociological projects, as well as essays and radio addresses by members of the Institute for Social Research upon its post-war return to Germany. So there's a transatlantic dimension built into that research project itself, too. Meanwhile, the experience with fascist agitation back in the US also led to individual studies such as Theodor Adorno's The Psychological Techniques of Martin Luther Thomas's Radio Addresses, as well as Leo Löwenthal's and Norbert Guterman's Prophets of Deceit, a study of the American agitator. There's a reason why these books have been recently reissued, along with a much later speech by Adorno to students in Vienna on aspects of the new right-wing radicalism. As contemporary scholars have noted in their forewords and afterwords to the new editions, these texts feel newly relevant today, in large part because they succinctly outline agitational themes, demagogic devices, and psychological techniques, or what they call in this literature often tricks, that we see the right wing using today. That includes the kinds of activism and appropriation I've been discussing here. It's consequently hard not to see Steve Bannon or Götz Kubitschek in Löwenthal's description of the agitator as, and I quote, the enemy of all established values, the spokesman of the apocalypse, and the carrier of disaffection. Similarly, Adorno seems to be describing the very patterns of aggressive resignification that we've been discussing today when he writes about Martin Luther Thomas's radio address. Their ultimate aim of the addresses, their ultimate aim is, quote, probably not so much the selling of a false argumentation as indeed the complete breakdown of a logical sense within the listeners and eventually the collapse of any meaning that the idea of truth may have for them. In view of such resonances, these books lend credence to Alex Ross's quip in the New Yorker in 2016 that the Frankfurt School knew Trump was coming. Let me conclude. But beyond such retrospective prophecy and the apparent recurrence today of the tricks of totalitarian propaganda and fascist agitation identified by the Frankfurt School almost a century ago, there's a deeper reason why these texts appear useful. They offer broader explanatory frameworks, rooting fascist agitation with all its smoke and mirrors in social malaise, in the isolation of individuals, in globalization, and an incipient neoliberalism. In returning to the text of critical theory, my question is consequently less whether Steve Bannon is MAGA's Father Coughlin, whether Kubitschek is the newest prophet of deceit, or whether Trump is a direct descendant of the 1930s American agitator. Rather, I ask what the critical theorists learned from their studies and how we might both historicize and adapt their insights to understand the patterns of contemporary so-called metapolitical activism. What this allows us to see, among other things, is that there's little hope of leaving the funhouse of metapolitics or of stepping off the accelerationist carousel and out of the mirror world of conceptual appropriation by simply reestablishing what is left and what is right and then favoring one over the other. To be sure, we would benefit from a greater commitment to differentiation and detail, from tending to the atrophied faculty of Unterscheidungsvermögen or the capacity to discriminate. But to unblur the concepts that metapolitics has blurred involves also refusing false equivalencies and reframing the debate. Here again, the critical theorists' historical interventions provide an important conceptual foothold for our own present. Far from limiting themselves to uncovering individual tricks of agitation or unmasking spurious claims, Adorno, Löwenthal, Marcuse, and others always posed the question at a more fundamental level of authoritarianism as a threat to democracy. As Horkheimer wrote in his introduction to Prophets of Deceit, quote, "Demagogy makes its appearance whenever a democratic society is threatened with internal destruction." As this formulation suggests, critical theorists were keenly aware that the threat rarely came from the outside, but was endemic to liberal democracy. In a famous 1959 speech on coming to terms with the past, Adorno would hold that, quote, "The survival of National Socialism within democracy was potentially more menacing than the survival of fascistic tendencies against democracy." And while I would not want to equate the new right with National Socialism, I do think that the former harbors fascistic tendencies that menace democracy today in ways similar to those described by critical theorists in the 1940s. This is ultimately where the metapolitical rubber hits the road, or rather, to return to Breitbart's metaphor, this is where we register the downstream effects of right-wing cultural politics. As Adorno noted when discussing the rise of a far-right party in Germany with students in Vienna 2 years before his death in 1969, quote, "Fascist movements are the wounds, the scars of a democracy that to this day has not yet lived up to its concept." The right-wing metapolitical project that I've sketched here is part of that growing scar tissue, a palpable and urgent reminder of the constant work that democracy requires from all of us if it is ever to live up to its concept. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes. First, I want to thank you for the work, the research that went into this, for spending time with these materials. I know how stressful this research has been. And one of the conversations we always have at the end of these talks is, you know, how are we hopeful here? And I'm going to ask the question. I think you did find the last part of your talk is asking us what more democracy looks like. And if maybe you could say a little something about what is more democracy in the face of these rising metapolitics that are so intensive in this moment.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and one that I'm not going to have a great answer for. But I'm reminded of probably my favorite protest slogan, which is, "Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." So the performative act of a gathering that appears in the name of democracy, which is a way in which I would interpret the responses to the Korrektiv research at the beginning of this year, that in Germany there was a marked coming together for democracy. At the same time, I always had this, there's always the question, if the democracy that is defended is simply against the right, then you are excluding the right from democracy as a concept, and therefore it becomes something less than democracy, right? So the reflexive gemeinsam gegen rechts, I think, is actually a form of democratic organizing that still needs to kind of find a better iteration. I don't have it. Except to say that in the moments where people gather and are aware of the fact that by gathering they are enacting democracy, I think is a really important one. I realize that I'm immediately getting into contradictions because in the mirror house, in the fun house that I've been describing, certainly there are members of the far right who would say that they're doing exactly that when they're organizing Querdenker demos. There's no question about that. That's very much part of it. And so that's not a way out of the funhouse. There's a question all the way in the back.
I want to thank you as well. And I have a question that goes a step back. I'm asking myself, haven't we seen something? Haven't we appreciated our democracy? Have we grown up in an environment where we are taking it for granted to live there? And I don't know if you have some answer to that. Thank you.
That's a kind of social psychology question, which I don't have a diagnosis. I do think and if you study these movements, it's very clear that in Germany, two things force that question, at least, if not an answer to it. One is unification, and the question of winners and losers of democracy and democratization and transition. And the other is Corona, which became an accelerant itself. So I talk about accelerationism as part of the right-wing movement. And Corona was an accelerant in the sense of, something to fan the flames to that. And both of those could have been wake-up calls for exactly what you're asking, right? Don't we know what we've got and what we're losing, if I understood your question correctly. And I'm ready and hopeful enoughly to think that for a lot of people, it was exactly that, and that the urgency for other kinds of organizing rise along with the threat. But again, I don't have my finger on the pulse of what we know that we've lost or haven't lost, except. This is anecdotal. I was listening today to one of these podcasts that I write about. I have to give another talk tomorrow, which is about the podcasts, really, where the theme of the podcast was something like Das gute Alte. So they were actually thinking, a group of 4 people in Schnellroda sitting together, thinking about what does it mean to go back to the good old days. And it just goes to show that the question poses itself on on both sides of the political divide, and I think also on the if I'm making camps here on the pro and anti-democratic side. And there was the 1980s, the good 1980s, when in 1985 the world was still in Ordnung, and it meant basically the West German Cold War consensus. So there is a sense in which there is a certain conservatism also in the movement that I'm describing as more avant-gardist and forward-oriented, but that plays into it as well. I think there was Margaret was first, and then you.
Thank you, Johannes. I was really interested in the comparison that you draw between the U.S. and Germany, but. One thing that seems different about the U.S. is the role of the religious right and how much religion is part of it. Trump is the new savior. He's being characterized in that way. So I wonder, what your thoughts are about what difference it makes that there's this set of religious themes in the U.S.
Yeah, first of all, that's true. Thanks for pointing that out. The Christian nationalist aspect of far-right organizing in the U.S. is rampant, and it's very, very prominent on the Bannon podcast. He really leans into it. Trump, to whom is a revenant of Christ, and he has Christian nationalists on and says, well, how would we ever countenance the opposite? Would it be atheistic globalism? Or, it's like as if we don't have to keep talking after that. And I think that does differentiate the tenor of the debate across the Atlantic drastically. It's always interesting to me that, and I haven't tracked this particular one, but that anything that happens in the US will eventually become borrowed and tried out here. So when, a couple examples, like when Talking Points USA goes into college campuses or Milo Yiannopoulos goes to Berkeley and kind of uses free speech as a weapon to show that the establishment is undemocratic or illiberal, right? That's the attempt. Then somebody will try that here too. And then the laws will be different, right? And what's allowed, and people will discuss the question of academic freedom differently. They'll discuss. So there's differences in the way things land, but there is a kind of transatlantic traffic, I think, in these memes. The one that I did track a little bit was cultural Marxism, which is, to my mind, a very Anglo-American invention. It's a whole conspiracy theory. I'm not going to go into the details. But it gets translated into Kulturmarxismus on this side. And then Alice Weidel from the AfD uses it. And suddenly, your ears start ringing if you speak both languages. And it sounds a lot like Kulturbolschewismus. It sounds like a Nazi term here, where there's one step in between. It's still really fascist, and it's anti-Semitic to boot. But cultural Marxism doesn't immediately ring that bell in the United States. So I think those differences happen, and that's how I imagine I would track if I was asking about religion. I would track, does it get imported? Do people try the Christian nationalist idea, the Judeo-Christian West, et cetera? And again, I expect it would fall differently on not just Germany, but a Europe of nations, which is also a conundrum for the far right because it's nationalistic at the same time. It wants to build a fortress Europe. So, but I think it'd be somewhat, that's the direction in which I'd pursue the question. You had a question.
I'd like to go back to your thank you. Brilliant, by the way, Johannes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'd like you to follow up on your point about the winners and losers from democratization and in particular transition. I think, clearly there were, and the right here has played that up. And from my experiences, and I spend quite a lot of time in the East, the resentment is deep and it's multi-generational. So my question is really, are there, you've pointed here to the sophistication of the new right and their ability to mobilize very sophisticated techniques and tools to sort of generate the action that you mentioned. But are there political strategies, economic strategies? What is it? What as Lenin said, what now to do? What can we do? What can be done to counter this? And is it in particular? Is it economic? Is it political? Is it literary? Is it? What is it, if anything?
Yeah.
Apologies for that.
Successful redistribution of wealth. Right. And it relates to Lee's also, right? What can we do? And I sort of wish that my colleague, Till van Raden, with whom I'm going to have a conversation at the Thyssen Foundation in a couple of weeks, was here, which we're pitching as, I'm going to do a similar talk. He is somebody who's interested in the forms and appeals of democracy on a cultural level as much as on an economic one or a political one or representation in terms of political representation, but also cultural representation. And I'm very eager to hear him out on how he thinks we can strengthen democratic cohesion and prevent democratic backsliding. Certainly I'm not telling anybody anything new, but that everybody needs the feeling that democracy works for them is the key issue here. I'm not sure that the people who I've been following would describe themselves ever as losers of democracy, right? So I think we're talking a little bit, we'd have to be demographically a little bit more specific in that sense. But they do mobilize the resentment very effectively, and there's in fact, in terms of the East-West divide that you also brought back up, there's a moment where the organizer, one of the key organizers who I'm tracking on the literary side is Susanne Dagen, who runs a bookstore in Dresden-Loschwitz and has been instrumental in kind of pushing an alt-right or new right agenda there, together with the people in Schnellroda. They're very tightly linked. There's a lot of personal connections. And they have this, in one of the podcasts, again, they sit down and they talk about the fact that the Schnellroda people who came over from the West, right, they move into the East and take up lodgings in this Rittergut, right, Schnellroda. But they're identified as coming from the West. And she says to them, oh, you don't quite understand, but because this is only your first dictatorship. So the mobilization against democracy is that democracy is dictatorship. And I think that's the hard thing to undo, right? Once that twist is established, it becomes very hard to untwist it or to unblur concepts, as I was saying. And I think that's a real task, and I'm aware of the fact that, reasoned political debate or learned lectures are, can only go so far in unblurring concepts for people who just buy into them hook, line, and sinker. And I haven't talked about the numbers of people who actually listen to these podcasts, which are hard to discern. Yeah. I've lost track of who's next. Is there anybody on the Zoom that we should let in? No. If there's not, how about up front and then in the back? You've been waiting. Yeah.
So thank you. First of all, also thank you for your lecture, which was also quite helpful for me to reflect a little bit more about this. I'm dealing a little bit as a citizen with this topic. So far, I would say Schnellroda and Metapolitik is to a certain extent an elitist game, but nevertheless, there's a breeding ground. There's I might say a growing resonance body at least in our society in Germany. And my question is, what made them so successful? Not in the technical term, because they are good in marketing, whatever, you explained it very impressively.
Yeah.
What the hell made them so successful?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great question, and I have to speculate. And I would, well, one thing I know is they haben langen Atem. They really play the long game. This is very much part of the theorization of metapolitics. Is we're not going to accede to power right away. We need to have more patience than the other side, essentially. So, and I think it's incontrovertible that they've been going for 20 years and they keep on doing their thing and they have their academies every year and Sezession comes out reliably 6 times a year, and it's an ongoing project. So it's this kind of the idea that eventually it'll snowball, it'll pick up. The other thing that I wonder more about, and maybe some of the investigative journalists in the room know more than I do, I know that people tried at one point to follow the money, and that would be very interesting to me, but I think, and my understanding is it's very hard. It's very hard to understand where the funding comes from. I look at the subscription series. I look at the price of the Akademien for the under 35-year-olds. They're very affordable. You get food. You basically just pay an Unkostenbeitrag and then you're in. They must be subsidized and funded, and I doubt that a publishing, even a well-running publisher is, and I'm not sure this is a well-running publisher, they publish everything in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th edition very quickly because the editions are really small. But then it looks like they have, they're in the 4th edition. They've had, they had a couple bestsellers, that we could go to, the kind of scandalous bestsellers. But again, I don't see them, I'm not an expert on this. I don't see the money coming through the operations. I don't know that the AFD is putting in money. I think they try to maintain plausible deniability there, although they visit all the time. So that would be the kind of material economic question. The ideological one, I think, has to do with just plying your trade consistently, being in people's face, and allying. So the networking is really important. Right? So you've got Zellner, who's doing the work in Austria, but constantly shows up in Schnellroda unless he's been banned from coming into the country, which he then uses for more audio analysis that he launches on his podcasts, et cetera. So it kind of, there's always something cooking. This is the activist side that I was describing. And these networks then kind of intranetwork, and I had a slide up of the YouTube, when I talked about YouTube, the YouTube networks. Somebody did really good work just to look who invites whom onto their shows. And that if you do that kind of network analysis, you see that it's actually ramifies really quickly. It's not just somebody speaking into a microphone. There's, then people who follow Susanne Dagen follow and you move from one to the next and you create a networked structure. So I think that's another aspect that I'd stress. Somebody in the back has been waiting for, on the aisle, been waiting for a while. What's the time?
Johannes, your talk reminds me of the days when you came to our home 40 years ago.
To babysit.
And discussed with me and my wife, who was your English teacher.
Yes.
Matters who are still there. Allow me to make some remarks. I asked myself during the whole talk, how relevant is what you have found out for the political situation in Germany? As an historian, as somebody who has worked for many years on the last aims of Adolf Hitler, what his intentions were, the stuff you present reminds me of the 20s. The same ridiculous things like in the Vienna days of Hitler and in the early days in Munich. I have to admit that we have laughed about it. The contemporaries have laughed about it, and it turned out to be very serious. So we are maybe in a present situation. But I would continue to argue that the strength of the AfD these days is mostly protest vote, still. We are in a transition period, and it will be now very important that the old parties of the Federal Republic are able to present not solutions, but certain ways out of the present mess. We cannot solve the problems in Germany of the whole world. And because of the Third Reich, maybe we have tried too much. It's not in our force. I follow the words of my famous colleague, the man between France and Germany, the name I've forgotten. Not Grosset, a double name. A famous writer, a journalist in Vietnam, a famous book on the US, Scholl-Latour, Peter Scholl-Latour.
Scholl-Latour.
Sorry. Scholl-Latour said shortly before his death, when you let in Calcutta, you become Calcutta. And the danger is there for Germany. And the East Germans are perceiving the situation differently from us. They are overwhelmed by the speed of change. And they believe that there is one lesson to learn from the 70s and 80s. The Poles went up and spoke out. And these Germans were silent until the last moment. Of course, then the mass protest came, but the difference between Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany at the time was there were no charismatic leaders in East Germany.
So
You had only the clergymen, and Merkel, in a certain way, was their successor, the daughter of a clergyman.
You're losing me on the geopolitics.
I'm coming to the end.
Is the question? Yeah.
I see the danger, and
Yeah.
I see a certain risk for turning out to reality of what you have said. When the new Germany, which is composed completely differently from the old Germany, when these new groups, which always existed, there were always little Kubitscheks in Germany, when they grow and when they are able to put their hand on the new Germans, then a real danger will come. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to go back to what I thought first was the question, are there lessons from history? I mean, as I mentioned, Volker Weiss has done a lot of work. Where are you, Volker? Has done a lot of work on the way that the conservative revolution is being picked up, refigured for the present, and used as a way of going back to a quasi-fascistic worldview that predates fascism, so that it becomes somehow manageable and not indictable as per se National Socialist, even if it might have led to National Socialism. So this kind of anticipatory moment feeling of what's going on is completely justified, and I think the comparisons that people drew from the late Weimar Republic and the Präsidialkabinette to the first Trump presidency, I think are certainly worth pursuing for historians. I'm not sure that they're predictive. My contribution here, I think, would really just be to say, let's also look at a society, for comparison, where even after National Socialism was beaten in Europe, after World War II, there were there was enough worry for the American Jewish Committee and the Frankfurt School to launch an enormous study in prejudice for fear of this thing growing back, right? And to analyze it at that moment, that might also be a relevant question for us today, like to pick up that line of inquiry. And I think, it's a line that Jim, as I mentioned, was also picking up by looking at the way that the federal theater program was quashed by an incipient McCarthyism. And these things, to be sensitive about them as happening in the cultural sphere, I think are as important as the Weimar connections that I think we've heard and we've come to think about. And again, they can be very productive. I'm not sure that they're predictive in that sense. Maybe one more question. I don't have what did we say what time it was? So we got a little more time. But I'm sure people are really warm and want drinks, which are right outside the door. So I think in the back also you were waiting, and then maybe here in the middle. And then maybe we can gather a couple questions and wrap up.
Thank you. You showed very well that the roots of meta-politics is on the left with Gramsci, and we're all experiencing that that it is a very successful strategy currently used by the right. My question is, do you think it's possible to conceive of or to think about the idea of centrist or liberal meta-politics? So can supporters of liberal democracy use these effective strategies in their struggle for liberal democracy, or is this the idea of liberal metaphysics a contradiction in itself, according to your reading?
Thanks. That's a really helpful, clarifying question, to which I want to answer simply by saying yes to the last. I think the reason I spent time trying to identify metapolitics as a right-wing concept is that I think it's politically positioned as a concept, and that the blurring of political lines, the appropriation, the aggressiveness with which it appropriates things are identified with an aggressive retrenchment that the right is seeking. And therefore, if I were to write recipes for centrist democratic organizing, it would not be to adopt metapolitics for the center. It reminds me a little bit of a debate that we have in a seminar that I teach on fascist cinemas, where at some point the students want to know, well, this propaganda is heinous, but couldn't there also be a good propaganda? And I want to say the same thing. I mean, you have to redefine. I mean, I understand what the question is, and I sympathize with your question, but I think you have to redefine your way away from the kind of not just connotations, they are denotative aspects of the term metapolitics that are written into it, that have bound it to a form of aggression and violence, semantic violence, as I called it, that I don't think one can undo. So that would be my position on this. I'm happy to debate it afterwards if you think that there's a chance. Maybe two more questions or three, and then I'll try to answer to all three of them, and then we'll wrap up. So there's one here in the middle. Yeah.
Less a question than noticing an irony. On the evening that you're doing this evening, the same evening that the local television station here, the RBB in Berlin, is hosting a discussion show aimed at young people, and they're talking about Donald Trump. And they're looking for people, Americans living in Berlin, who can discuss and explain to German young people that not everything that Trump is doing might be bad or scary.
Oh.
So it's just an interesting irony that you're doing this evening as well.
Okay. Yeah.
For your attention for maybe later.
To which I'll respond that the last time we were in Germany 5 years ago, Kerstin was running a study abroad program, and we brought 30 students, and they all had to answer for Donald Trump. Like, that was their experience of coming to Germany. And it's different now. I feel like, when we came over in January, it felt more like people wanted to know, is Donald Trump going to become president again? And I guess we all want to know that. But the counter question was, what's going on here? So I think, but that's just anecdotal too. James, you had a question? This is the nepotist part of the evening. This is my cousin.
I waited.
Thank you, yeah,
Just curious, you went through the use of language and you called it a funhouse.
yeah.
To my mind, traditional media has a huge responsibility to help readers sort, because I think there's language on both sides that's intended to be evocative. One of the reasons I think to the answer the last question, the language of the center is not evocative. It's hard to do propaganda about what the center thinks, but the question is really, is the media up to that challenge in a world that tends to create networks and all that stuff?
Yeah, what is media in the age of social media and a kind of decentric public sphere? I should say about the center, because we're all talking about centrist counters, and I think one thing that my research tells me, and I think we should take away, is that the center is a malleable thing that has moved fairly far to the right. Right? So it's not just that there is a stable center that sits somewhere in the middle, and you know, sometimes there's this idea of the horseshoe that, you know, people climb up the left side of the horseshoe or the right of and they'll eventually meet somewhere. But as part of the metapolitical organizing, I would grant that there is a certain success on the right of moving the center of discourse rightward. So I think we should be careful about just assuming that if we do centrist organizing, you know, things will work out. I think the question, that's why I end up on this question of democracy versus totalitarianism. I think the question is democracy, which is a question that, you know, can't be answered by let's keep everybody in the center. That's what I said about the demonstrating too. You have to demonstrate not against the right, but for democracy, right? So and the media question, that's a hard one. I mean, yes, I'm a media scholar, but I don't have an answer to, you know, can the media, you know, save us from disintegrating discursive networks of the kinds that or from these fun houses that are really vexing, and that, and where there's a limit. Every time you write about it and think about it, there's also a limit of just enlightenment or critique. You know, you can pull these apart, but they will recoagulate in other spaces again. It feels a little bit hydra-headed. So, yeah, that's not a happy note to end on. So maybe last question, take us out with one more. Yeah, last one.
Thank you. I just take your last words. Going back nearly half a century ago, I asked my dad, what is the best system to rule a people? He looked at me. I think he thought about Marc Aurelian. He said, dictatorship.
Oh.
And he said, if you have a very wise person, a person who really thinks of his people, dictatorship is the best way to rule it. Now, taking your last words, is the far right hypothetic becoming the power interested in democracy, or are they already in their mind on a way to dictatorship? So that, in conclusio, the weaker democracy is, the more strength comes to the right.
Yes, and but remember that democracy is the stepping stone for the right. They will always invoke democracy. This is the point that the Frankfurt School makes about liberal democracy. The threat comes from inside democracy, and they will always invoke democracy as the basis on which they're mounting their attack. And again, a Querdenker-Demonstration is a demonstration, and so we have to countenance it. It's really interesting what you say, in that it's half a century ago, and this will be the last thing I'll say, because there's a film called Deutschland im Herbst, very famous. It's a response by a set of German filmmakers, really representative cross-section. Volker Schlöndorff, who's a trustee here, was involved. And one of the people who contributes a piece of film is Rainer Werner Fassbinder, one of the most famous of German filmmakers. And there's a segment that I've always thought would be worth returning to now, where he harangues his mother about how we should respond to, at the time, left-wing terrorism, right? The RAF And he's completely paranoid and doesn't know what to do. So he pulls his mother in, his actual mother, who is also sometimes an actress in his film, and he really harangues her and said, what should we do? What should we do? Until she finally says, well, what we need is, a dictator, just a really gentle, kind one. And it's a great way of showing up that, this is a dead end. All right, so I'm going to end there.